Senator Singh.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak in opposition to this bill, along with all of us here in the opposition Senate, because of three factors. The first of those factors is that this bill will clearly have a detrimental effect on the rehabilitation and recovery of people with serious mental illness in psychiatric care. The second reason is because of the lack of consultation that it will leave patients, their families and carers and psychotic facilities unprepared for this change. And thirdly, because it is fundamentally discriminatory to people who have been determined to suffer from a serious mental illness. Now, we know that this bill will take income support payments away from people in psychiatric confinement charged with a serious offence and who are undergoing a course of rehabilitation. And yes, it is that rehabilitation, I think, that is in effect at gravest concern here as far as their ongoing recovery path, but more so the fact that it is addressing the psychiatric confinement of people charged with a serious crime, treated the same way as a person in jail convicted of an offence of a serious crime. And that should not be the case. It is right that social security payments may not be paid to a person in prison, but we are not talking here about people in prison. We are talking about people that have been charged with a serious offence. There is indeed a significant difference between people in psychiatric confinement charged with an offence that, because of mental impairment, are found criminally responsible for their actions, and people in prison who are responsible for their actions. So, for some of these reasons, Labor will not be supporting this bill, but I do want to thank the contributions made by particularly Senator McAllister and Senator Moore and Senator Siewert, who I know have had a lot of interest and perhaps have participated in the inquiry onto this bill. Having had some regard to the Labor Senator's dissenting report, there is clearly a lot of issues in this bill from a technical, and practical point of view, such as the definition of serious offence, the financial impact of the bill, the impact of clinical service delivery and reintegration, and the definition of a period of reintegration. I noticed from Labor's dissenting report the fact that there were an overwhelming number of submissions raising concerns about the distinction, for example, between serious and non-serious offences, which I understand the department was not able to satisfactorily address. I also understand that many participants raised concerns about the financial implications in this bill. In particular, submitters raised concerns about the possibility of increased costs for service provisions due to the impact on the forensic patient's rehabilitation. Of course, there are concerns, quite rightly, that have been made by various state governments as well, because it is very much so a cost-shifting mechanism. I can't really understand the point, to be honest, of this bill coming before the Senate, other than to say it is about cost shifting. I think that is the only real rationale behind the government bringing this bill forward, because I cannot find one other than that. And cost shifting, of course, to the states is doing so by cost shifting also, though, to the most vulnerable in our community. And I find it, I guess I'm fairly cynical about the broader response through the media on this bill, because there's been little of it. And it's almost like we're talking about some of the most vulnerable in our community, but also perhaps some may say that because of that, some outlets simply don't care simply don't care about this bill and the impact it will have on some of those most vulnerable individuals and their families and their carers, because I've seen little reporting about this, and I would hope that as a compassionate society, as a humane society, we would stand up for the most vulnerable in our community and provide them with the protections that they need. Now, one of the protections they do need, of course, when we're talking about people with mental illness, is rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is the fundamental thing when we talk about supporting those vulnerable individuals who are suffering from mental illness. And we know in this country at the moment there are waiting lists all over the country for those needing to access rehabilitation. So taking income support payments away from people who are in desperate need of rehabilitation, who are subject to psychiatric confinement, who have been charged with a serious offence, this is no way to treat those people. It is no way to treat people that are vulnerable in our community. And yet this is what we have come to expect, Mr Acting Deputy President, from this government. Attacks on the most vulnerable, attacks on those in our society who can least afford to pay it. And yet those that can afford to pay get away scot-free with not paying their fair share of tax, continuing to grow their profits, to the detriment of those that are most vulnerable in our community. So, of course, as you would expect, the Labor Party does not support a bill that does that. Now, what I also don't understand is, it has been since something like 1986 that this legislation has provided that a person undergoing psychiatric confinement who is undertaking a course of rehabilitation can receive this type of income support payment. That is an incredibly long time that has crossed both Labor and Liberal governments since 1986. So why is it now that under the Abbott government we have this bill come before us to take that income support payment away? I mean, for the minuscule saving that this Commonwealth government will make, does it really think that it's in the best interests of our society, of those families and carers, of those individuals that are undergoing this rehabilitation, that are in this particular category, to take that income support payment away? I mean, I just do not understand for the life of me the rationale behind this government in doing this to some of the most vulnerable. Now, the other problem with this, which is why I am perplexed as to why we're debating this, and I really do hope and I encourage those crossbench senators to not support this bill so it does not become law. I also don't understand why, if the government wants to get this through the parliament, if it wants to make its pittance of savings in this way, why it didn't consult. Why didn't it consult with some of these families and carers? Why didn't it consult more extensively, in fact, with some of the service providers? Clearly there needs to be a lot more discussion and a lot more meaning behind what it's talking about even in this legislation, this opaqueness around serious and non-serious offence. I just cannot see, as Senator McAllister said, any good public policy outcome coming out of this piece of legislation. So, no consultation, didn't speak to patients. This government didn't speak to anyone impacted, in fact, by the outcomes of this legislation. Didn't speak to families, didn't speak to carers, didn't speak to state or territory governments, didn't speak to psychiatric institutions that provide the care. It really just shows, Mr Acting Deputy President, that there has been no genuine effort made by this government to communicate its decision to ensure that those impacted by the measures in this bill are aware of the change and can then, of course, make some preparations accordingly. And we are talking about incredibly vulnerable people, people who rely very much on every cent of their income support payments and on the rehabilitation connected to that. I think it is really doing an incredible disservice to the mentally ill in our country and to their families and to their carers in the way it has gone about this. It is simply not good enough. Proper consultation, proper discussion is so needed for such a complex, sensitive and serious matter. Now, getting back to the Senate inquiry, and I understand it was a robust inquiry in the sense there was obviously a submission process, but not one of those submissions, not one, supported these changes in this bill. So that in itself tells the government something. It tells the government that it is on the wrong end of the stick with this piece of legislation. No support in the community. We know it didn't consult, but thank goodness we do have in this part of our democracy, the Senate committee process that does allow for public hearings, for a public inquiry, for that kind of level of consultation, which of course is a cross-party committee. Not one submission supported this bill. In fact, Minister Morrison's own department, their submission provides no justification for this bill. So no evidence that these measures will assist in the rehabilitation of people in psychiatric confinement, and therefore no justification for supporting this bill. Now finally, out of those three issues that I raised in my opening address as to why Labor would not support this bill, I want to go to the issue of rehabilitation, because this bill particularly undermines rehabilitation. Again, the submissions to the inquiry suggest that the bill very much does undermine rehabilitation efforts of people in psychiatric confinement. The training, employment and other community links are put in place whilst a patient is in psychiatric confinement to help ensure a successful transition at the time of discharge is incredibly important. Access to income support is crucial to establishing these links. Absolutely crucial. Patients self-fund their external rehabilitation activities, their transport to attend activities and any supplies required to carry them out, and patients fund these activities from their income support payments. So you can see how, in the path to rehabilitation, those links can be broken without that income support payment being there. Those links to training, those links to employment, those links to ongoing rehabilitation, if that income support payment isn't there. If the money isn't there for them to attend, to get the transport to attend their various activities. The cost of accessing general health care, purchasing medications in the community is also met, of course, by the patient, with obviously the concessions from their healthcare card. Access to income support is also essential for patients to secure and maintain their community accommodation, and that things that they need to order to be granted leave and eventually to be discharged. But yet, under this proposed bill, it suggests income support payments will not be made available to a patient charged with a very serious offence until they've been granted 3 nights per week of overnight leave. Well, I understand in Victoria that is the maximum amount of leave that is able to be granted by a psychiatric institution. So you can see again how this lack of consulting with, say, a Victorian psychiatric institution or the Victorian government shows just how thought-bubbled this legislation is and how it doesn't work in the real world. And if it doesn't work in the real world, then it will lead to a breakdown in that rehabilitation path for that individual that is so in need of it. So I think the chair of the Mental Health Commission, Professor Alan Fels, really summed up these issues in the Commission's submission into the Senate inquiry. And I quote, "The practical effect of removing access to social security payments would be detrimental to rehabilitation and recovery for people with a mental illness, especially without close consultation with the states and territories." So on every yardstick, this government is completely out of touch with community expectations, with the care and understanding of people confined with psychiatric treatment, with public policy outcomes, because there simply isn't one good one in this piece of legislation. It will have detrimental effects on rehabilitation and recovery with people with serious mental illness. They should not be treated the same as those that have already been convicted and imprisoned. They have been charged. They are still in this country, as I understand it, innocent until proven guilty. The government hasn't consulted. It's leaving patients, their families and their carers and psychotic facilities very underprepared about this change if it were to pass. And it is my dear hope that it does not pass. It is why? Because fundamentally, even though those points are enough in themselves, it is discriminatory to people who have been determined to suffer from a serious mental illness. And what does it say about us as a country if we want to pass legislation in this place that discriminates people with their mental illness? We already know that they are some of the most vulnerable people in our country that so many, unfortunately, have already forgotten about. Well, for us on this side of the chamber, we have not forgotten about them. We very much stand with them in the hope that they are led to a path of recovery. And they will only be led to a path of recovery if the right supports are in place. And one of those supports, which has been in place since 1986, is this income support payment. It is crucial to build those links for their rehabilitation along that pathway to their rehabilitation. There is simply no need on earth for this cruel, demonising Abbott government to bring legislation in this place that does nothing more than discriminate some of these most vulnerable people in our community. So Labor will not support this bill, and I stand with my fellow Senate colleagues, thank them for their work in Labor's dissenting report into the inquiry, and I also stand with those in our community that find themselves in this place, in this situation in their lives, in the hope that they do recover through the support of rehabilitation and, most importantly, through the support of their ongoing support of their income support payment.